Welcome to Break the Chains, America's top radio source of information for people struggling with drug or alcohol addiction and those who love them. And now, the host of Break the Chains, Gwen Carden.
Dr. Sylvester Sfiocla, known by most people as Dr. Skip, earned accolades and riches as a successful, driven, and brilliant graduate of Harvard Medical School. He eventually became physician to some of the biggest rock bands in the world, including Bon Jovi and Def Leppard. For years, he reveled in wealth and glamour. He jet-setted across the U.S. He belonged to the finest country clubs, and he lived in a California mansion. But then he became addicted to Vicodin and to alcohol. That led to the disintegration of his cushy, extravagant life, and he found himself stripped of his license to practice medicine, broke, homeless, shunned by his beloved wife and 4 children, and working in a sandwich shop, a job from which he got fired. At one point, he was taking 150 Vicodin a day. Yes, I said that right, a day. And he was drinking massive amounts of alcohol. After finally getting sober and enduring many years of battling the bureaucracy in California in a fruitless bid to get his medical license back, he moved to Rhode Island, and there they did eventually reinstate his license, and he now works in the addiction medicine field as Director of Medical Assisted Recovery in Warwick, Rhode Island. We're going to spend the entire hour today with Dr. Skip, and he's going to detail his journey from Harvard to hell and back, which also happens to be the title of his new book. Welcome to the show, Dr. Skip.
Well, thank you, Gwen. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, let me begin by asking you this question. Why did you write this book?
2 main reasons. First, there are many faces of addiction, and some of the ones are more commonly thought of than others, and I certainly didn't have the most common face of addiction, but in the end, addiction to alcohol and or drugs or both leads just about all of us either to death or darn close. And I wanted to show that I'm just one of many faces of addiction who was able to carry it off till he was 52, but that didn't make me any different from the final fall. And the second and probably more important reason I wanted to write the book was, although I didn't realize it at the time, once I finally got on top of the addiction, and I don't think I'm ever cured of it naturally, but now some 13 years later, I find that there is enormous joy in recovery, something which I don't think people who are struggling to stop really understand. It doesn't look like being normal is very much fun when you're trying to beat the addiction and everybody's down on you that knows you and loves you, but bottom line is when you finally let go and get better, you actually experience more joy than you ever did at your highest moments.
That is a wonderful message, and I hope that people who need to hear that are listening today. Let's move forward a little bit. I'd like you to tell listeners about your early background. I mean, I read in your book, those were pretty heady days where fame and fortune befell you in what seemed like almost a magical fashion. What was it like before you got involved?
I was very fortunate. I was born to a middle-class family in Brockton, Massachusetts, a working town, and my family was wonderful. I never saw drinking or drugs in the family. My grandparents, who were immigrants on my father's side, were hardworking and had more money than most people in the little ghetto in which we lived, but we were basically middle class. I happened to be fortunate in that I loved school, and I started to do very well at school. I was a big guy. I had a silly name, Sylvester. I got teased a lot, and I used to get beaten up by older, smaller kids, and I couldn't understand why. I guess it's because I was being a smart aleck in school. I really, all the way through grammar school, it was very easy for me to go to school. And the reason I mention that is football became a very important part to me when I got to high school. I had done very well in Brockton, graduated at the top of the class, and then went on to Boston College High School, which is a Jesuit high school in Boston. It was a bit challenging, but that became a very easy target for me. I also wanted to play football, and the combination of getting pretty much all A's through high school and becoming the co-captain of the football team and playing pretty well allowed me a chance to visit a lot of Ivy League schools, and I essentially applied to a bunch of them, and even a couple of schools outside of the Ivy League that were eager for me to play football for them, and eventually ended up trying out for getting into Harvard. I chose Harvard, went there. Again, I had to start my football career all over again, but by the end of the time at Harvard College, not only was I doing very, very well in studies, but I had become a pretty good member of the football team. I actually, my last year, garnered one vote for the Heisman Trophy. Now, anybody who knows about the Heisman Trophy vote, as the best college football player in America, knows that the winner gets thousands of votes, and I got one third place vote, but bottom line is I did get it. I also received that was a very kind sports writer. I also received was not drafted by the NFL, but I got a letter asking me to come try out for the Chicago Bears, and if I made the team, they were going to sign me with a $5,000 bonus. And to put it in perspective, that's at a time when the famous Joe Namath had been made $400,000 bonus. So I wasn't a great football player, but I was good enough to at least be asked to try out for the NFL. At the same time, because of a lot of accomplishments in college, I was accepted to Harvard Medical School. I decided to go to Harvard Medical School instead of going in and trying out for the NFL. I'm not sure that was the right decision at the time. I never would have made the team, but it would have been fun to have been flattened by some really good pros. But in any event, I went to medical school, and for the first time in my life, I didn't really grasp the situation. I was one child among 99 other adults. I didn't realize it until midway through my first year at Harvard Medical School. I had been accepted. I had certainly done well enough in terms of all the studies and all the preparation for it. But that all had come easily to me. I went to Harvard Medical School. They began a pass-fail system that year, and my first sort of immature, and I think maturity and addiction go hand. Immaturity and addiction can go hand in hand, and we can talk about that later if we have time. But basically, I continued to try to lead a pretty leisurely lifestyle, and I got all the way through my first year at the medical school at Harvard with thinking I was doing okay, but since they weren't putting grades on exams, I had no idea how badly I was doing. It was also the summer when the Boston Red Sox had a guy named Carl Yastrzemski, and they were trying to run for the pennant. Fenway Park is very close to Harvard Medical School. I used to leave my anatomy class with serious students and go watch the Red Sox. Took the thing too lightly. Did fall in love with the most beautiful woman I'd ever met, and decided to marry her at the end of that first year. And the day before I was leaving to go home and to get married, I got a call from the dean, who called me over to his office and said, "Well, Skip, I got some bad news for you. I don't know what you're doing tomorrow." I said, "Well, I'm getting married." And he said, well, you didn't pass your first year. And so for the first time in my life, I was really handed a reality sandwich. He said, "Well, we should have, told you, perhaps, been in more contact with you during the year, but you must have known you weren't doing well." I said, "Yes, I didn't think I was doing very well, but I didn't think I'd failed." Mm-hmm. And he said, "Why don't you go and have a good wedding if you can, and come back and see us after your honeymoon, and we're going to test you and see if you can stay here." The real first evidence of my addiction, I think, popped up there. Like any good incipient addict, I went home, was pretty sick to my stomach, and thought, what am I going to do with this horrible news? And my poor wife, who had thought she was, marrying a prize, I couldn't very well tell her. And so I did what all good addicts do, and that's lie. I ignored it, didn't mention it, went down to Rhode Island, married my wife, and took off for a 10-day honeymoon, which, needless to say, wasn't as good as it might have been.
Yeah.
The whole time I was in the honeymoon, I thought, well, I'll tell her tomorrow. And bottom line,
tomorrow never came.
Tomorrow never came, certainly not for 3 or 4 months. So I flew back. We got back in at Boston. I told my wife that I was going to go do some research at the medical school in between my first and second year. And I spent that first week back from the honeymoon being examined by a whole flock of doctors trying to see whether or not I was crazy or whatever the problem was. Of course, I lied about doing any drinking or drugging. And at that point, I really sort of did do sporadic drinking and occasional drugging if there was some amphetamine around to study or something like that. But it hadn't controlled my life yet, except, of course, my immaturity and my lack of study had really set me back. So I was this is the first time in my life I'd really failed at anything, and I was lost. after a week's worth of pretty much day-long exams, I got called back into the office, and I was told that I guess I was smart enough to stay. I had scored highly enough that they weren't going to just bounce me, but that there was a very good medical school in North Carolina that would accept me as a second-year student along with some special tutoring if I wanted to go down in North Carolina. I immediately took umbrage at that and thought, heck, I can do the medical school again, and I repeated my first year. Bottom line is, I started to study, I got better, and I fell in love with surgery. All of a sudden, I grew up in a hurry in terms of my career, and I started acting much more like an adult, although I will say that I occasionally drank, and I, would occasionally do what some college students would do, and smoke a little marijuana, take a little amphetamine. But bottom line, I got much more serious, fell in love with surgery, wanted to be the world's greatest gallbladder surgeon. I loved the right upper quadrant where your gallbladder is hidden under your liver. I wanted to, if I could take those out for the rest of my life, I didn't even care if I got paid. And I really developed a second passion after football, and that was operating in the abdomen. It wasn't quite as sexy as neurosurgery or cardiac surgery, but bottom line is I loved it. Went on, decided to leave the Boston area, went to California, and began a surgery residency, which was wonderful. I never had so much fun in my life. I was well into my senior residency year when the operating room had become a real haven for me. Life was good. I'd gotten back on track, and I loved doing what I was doing when I had an accident to my right hand, and I'm right-handed. And suddenly, after many hours of surgery and many months in a cast, my right hand didn't function that well. The operating room, and that accident, by the way, had nothing to do with drinking or drugging. It was just an accident where a bowl exploded and cut my right wrist and right hand. And although the Department of Surgery at UCSD, where I was, told me they would keep me in doing research, and while I rehabbed my hand, after 9 months of rehab, I decided to try to go back into surgery. It was a foreign place to me now. I was afraid to go in there. And I got my first change of careers. I got a chance to go to Los Angeles. My hand was good enough to do emergency room work, and I started a 25-year emergency room career, which wasn't as much fun as surgery, but which offered me a second chance because the operating room had become a very scary place to me, where I had been previously very good at surgery, and now I was afraid to be in there. Emergency medicine turned out to be interesting, wonderful in a lot of ways. And also begins my slow downfall. With lots of money, lots of time off, I developed habits where I would go to the finest bars, hung out in Beverly Hills, bars and restaurants that are well known, and began to drink too much. Would occasionally indulge in getting some opioids or some amphetamines. And although I could control it, I thought it slowly started to grab at me. So at that point, I met a man who was half owner of the Roxy and the Whiskey and the Rainbow, which are big nightclubs on the Sunset Strip, and I began a medical career of taking care of a lot of rock and roll stars. And over the next 10, 15 years, I took care of some of the greatest, at least rock and roll stars in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Life seemed to be good. I had a home in La Jolla, California, moved down there, had wonderful cars, had 4 beautiful, wonderful children, all accomplished. Life seemed good on the outside, but alcohol and drugs were slowly eating away at me. And my career actually was doing pretty well. I was had other doctors working for me. Life seemed good on the outside, but obviously something was wrong. I ballooned up to over 400 pounds. Ended up having in the early 90s one of the early gastric bypass surgeries, and that I really think I was supposed to stop drinking after that surgery. I did try to cut down. I found that I couldn't. I started to really get in trouble, and then with with a side issue of a little pain, I got hooked on Vicodin, and the combination of Vicodin and vodka eventually took me all the way down. So
okay, well, listen, let's stop right there for a moment. Unfortunately, we've got to take a break, but stay tuned. We'll be right back with more interesting conversation with Dr. Skip.
And now back to Gwen Carden on Break the Chains.
Welcome back. Today we're talking with Dr. Skip Sviocla, whose new book, From Harvard to Hell and Back, details his descent into drugs and alcohol and his ultimate redemption. Dr. Skip, right before the break, you mentioned that you had ballooned up to 400 pounds and had had gastric bypass surgery, and that had some definite influence on what happened to you next in terms of your addiction. So I'd love for you to continue a little bit with that part of your story.
Sure, terrific. Of note, it looks as though gastric bypass surgery, which is becoming more common, is really affecting a whole lot of people. I have contracts with the nursing board, the medical board here in California, and I'm sorry, I'm not in California anymore, in Rhode Island. And one of the things I do now when I get people in here is ask them when they had their gastric bypass surgery, and they look at me amazed. The number of people who are succumbing to addictions later in their life after gastric bypass is on the way up. But anyway, I'm living proof of that. I was not supposed to drink at all. I had lied to the psychiatrist who interviewed me prior to the surgery at Scripps Clinic, and then I said that I would be able to just not have anything to drink afterwards. Bottom line is, previous to the surgery, I could easily hold down 6, 7, or 8 double vodkas, and very, very few people ever even knew that I drank. I certainly did not act drunk. I never had a DUI, although God knows there were many nights that's the grace of God. But in any event, after the surgery, I tried to drink again, and I started to drink, and 2 or 3 doubles was the limit, and sometimes that amount of drinking would put me in a blackout. There was some post-op complications a little bit after the surgery. I was stabbed in the sciatic nerve by a nurse who was giving me an injection of antibiotics that gave me a pretty severe pain down my leg. And I had gotten back on Vicodin, which I had successfully gotten off of right after the surgery. And when I got the taste for that over the ensuing months, after my doctors wouldn't give me any more, and I didn't want to ask new doctors, I began to write my own prescriptions for it. And because I had good relationships with a lot of medical staff and nurses, I had this elaborate plan. Again, I was already deep into the addiction at this point, where I would send nurses and other people who would help me go get prescriptions under false name and bring it back to me. The bottom line is, I had developed the tolerance to get up to 150 Vicodin a day. And the reason I know I was taking 150 a day for the last 40 days was the district attorney of San Diego told me. They had started to follow, and they'd been tipped off by some pharmacists, and they kept an eye out. And I had been writing prescriptions in other names and then having them come back, and I would give them the money to go buy it, come back and bring it to me. And I remember that when I was driving home one day while I was at that terrible rate, I drove by my house in La Jolla, California. It wasn't quite a mansion, but it was a beautiful home near the water in La Jolla. It was certainly a mansion compared to what I live in now. And I saw 3 people standing at the door with my wife, and I can't remember if they were exactly in black, but metaphorically they sure were, and I was hoping they were Jehovah's Witnesses or somebody selling something, but they were in fact the Medical Board of California. I could tell by the pained look on my wife's face that something was up. She looked beyond them, looked at me. I stepped on the gas and took off and thought, well, the jig is up now. And I went and hid in the best hotel in La Jolla, California. It didn't take my wife long, a couple days to find me. I locked myself in a room, ordered the finest booze and the finest food, and tried to wean myself off those 150 Vicodin a day. I probably had 100 left in my pocket, and I tried to do that by drinking. I was clearly a mess. I was disgusting. My wife finally found me. Actually called one of the psychiatrists that had dealt with me before, who I'd been lying to right along, had him come in and try to coax me out of the room, and I he went out screaming, I can't help him. I was finally, my wife, with the help of some of my kids, got me home, and I had to face the music at the medical board. Medical board immediately suspended my license, eventually revoked it, and told me I could reapply after a couple of years. Then the criminal authorities came in, and I could have gone to jail. We were able to plea bargain down fraudulent prescription writing, but I was scared to death I was going to go to jail. I wasn't afraid of much, but I didn't think jail was a good thing to do when you were 52 years old, or in any time for that matter. And my world fell apart. I had to sell my beautiful home in California. The IRS came and took it away because although I was making about $500,000 a year, I was probably spending almost $1 million, and I hadn't paid my taxes in a couple of years. And I had wrecked my life because I was able to fake my prosperity for so long. I didn't drink or drug for about 3 months, and then I fell into a second cycle of addiction where I resumed drinking, and we had to leave our home in California. I had to go mooch off some of my children who were kind enough to let us do that. My wife had to go back to work. We eventually ended up in Manhattan Beach, California, living in a very cheap one-bedroom apartment over a Bikram yoga studio where it's very hot normally, and in California it was even hotter. It was a horrible place. My wife was working hard just to pay that little rent. We had lost everything, and I was essentially homeless. Technically, I could come into the house, but I just didn't. I was ashamed to come home, and she was working hard after not working for 30 years, and I was still drinking, running away, hiding, sleeping on the beach, and I was a total disgusting wreck. I looked like every classic picture of an alcohol-dependent person. I looked bad, I smelled bad, and I just wanted to die. I took up residence on the roof of that apartment that we lived in, and I would occasionally look over the edge and look down and think, I really like to end it all, but if I jump off this 3-story roof, I'm just going to make matters worse. So I'd go back to sitting in the roof and drinking, and I began, sort of my salvation started creeping in when I would go to AA meetings and I would sit in the back of the room. They were very kind. As long as I shut my mouth and sat in the back of the room, I could watch and listen to people talk. And I would think over and over again, God, I'm just like these people. And I couldn't figure out why I couldn't stop, but I knew I was just like those people. Well, as my life really degenerated, as I got to sleeping probably 30 minutes a day, I looked and smelled like every horrible alcoholic, and I know the misery. And I just wanted to die, but I was so deep into the alcoholism that when I would pass out, I might sleep for 30 or 40 minutes and then wake up and have to face another whole day ahead of me, and I just thought, this is hopeless. And I kept thinking, I've got to be able to figure this out. After all, I'm a smart guy, even though the evidence was all to the contrary. And I was staring at this bottle of Pop-Off vodka on the roof. It was about half empty, might still be up there, in fact. And I was trying hard to figure out, how can I control this? What can I do? How do I stop? When all of a sudden I had an insight. Now, a lot of people insist it's a spiritual moment, and I personally think it was, but I'm not so spiritually certain that I would project that. Maybe it was just I finally got as smart as I thought I was. But suddenly I had what I like to liken to an Escher print moment. You know, M.C. Escher does these wonderful prints where are the stairs heading up or down? Are the birds flying left or right? Are they blackbirds on a white background or white birds on a black background? You're looking at a print which has the same amount of information in it, but suddenly you see the opposite side of you can see it one of two ways. And at that moment, something in my brain clicked, and it was as simple as, gee, you know what? I'm not like those alcoholics. I'm one of them. Now, that sounds ridiculously simple, and I do think that getting sober is sometimes too simple for smart people. And I suddenly went, wow, I got this. I know a whole bunch of alcoholics who are happy and living a life, and what do they have in common? They don't drink anymore. They stop trying to control it. So at that moment, December the 1st, 2000, I just the urge to drink left me. I knew I was in for a pretty bad detox. I climbed down off the roof, went and said to my wife, "Can I come inside tonight? I think I'm done." She said, "I've heard that before." I said, "You're just going to have to wait. I really think this is it, but I'm going to have to prove it to you." And I haven't had a drink since that day. The detox was bad. The climb back to get my license was horrendous. California was very punitive, and they had a right to be. It just seemed that they kept moving the goalposts. After I got sober and did everything I was supposed to do, they made it very difficult. And so then we decided to move back to Rhode Island, and I was able to come back. I still had to do everything I had left California with to get my license back in order for Rhode Island to honor me, but they didn't keep changing the rules, and I was able to get my license back. Then decided that I'd have a second chance in life of changing a career. And again, for the second time in my life, there was a new career beckoning. Emergency medicine had bailed me out the first time when I left surgery. And now addiction medicine was a brand new specialty. And I thought, look, I'm an addict by experience. I might as well be an addict by training, too. And so I studied hard when I got my license back, became board certified in addiction medicine. And now I love helping people getting better, hopefully, before they're 52 years of age, the way it took me. So that's how it all went down. And now for the last a decade or so, I've been able to help a lot of folks. We use Suboxone in a recovery-based mode here to help people off opiate addiction, but we here in my office, we have contracts with most of the professional boards in the state of Rhode Island, and we help a lot of professional people get back and monitor them, and life is good again. I had been leading a horrible existence, a double life when I was taking the drugs and alcohol, and now honesty started to flood my life, and by God, it's a heck of a lot better. To be honest, something that never occurred to me until I got recovery.
Well, listen, we need to take another break right now, but we'll continue talking to Dr. Skip about his amazing life story in just a couple of minutes, so don't go away.